Hey guys, tonight we step into the hush of ancient Mesopotamia, where moonlight seems to cling to mud brick walls and the dust of old tablets waits quietly inside temple rooms, as if a scribe has only just set down his stylus and gone out for water. You move through that dimness with a simple question and a complicated title in hand. Akkadian texts reveal the Anunnaki hid a second creation of humanity. That title sounds dramatic, and to be fair, ancient Mesopotamia does enjoy a dramatic entrance, but we'll keep our sandals on solid ground. Some parts of this journey are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm what-if imagination. The texts might hint they may overlap. They could preserve older ideas in broken form, and historians debate where myth ends and theory begins. You probably won't survive this place very well if you expect air conditioning, clean water, or a polite break from brick making. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and tell me your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin as so many good mysteries begin with clay. Not glamorous clay, of course. Not the kind on a pottery influencer's table with perfect lighting and a soothing ceramic playlist. This is river mud kneaded by hands, shaped into tablets, dried beneath the sun, sometimes baked hard by intention, and sometimes by accident, especially when cities burned. Most historians agree that without this humble material, much of Mesopotamian civilization would have slipped away almost entirely. Stone inscriptions are durable and dramatic, yes, but clay is chatty. Clay remembers taxes, hymns, contracts, insults, omens, prayers, and the occasional human tendency to make administration feel eternal. And among those thousands upon thousands of tablets, written in cuneiform, pressed line by line with a reed stylus, sit the stories of gods and beginnings. Archaeology suggests that by the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia, BCE scribes in Mesopotamia were already copying, adapting and preserving older traditions in both Sumerian and Akkadian. The evidence we do have points to a world where stories were not frozen in place. They moved. They were translated, reshaped, reorganized and taught in schools. A careful reading might suggest that what survives is less one clean original story and more a family of stories sharing a roof, arguing over dinner, and pretending not to notice their contradictions. That matters tonight, because the phrase second creation of humanity does not sit neatly in the mainstream historical summary of Mesopotamian religion. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is not a standard conclusion. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths include accounts of humans being made by the gods, often for labour service or the maintenance of divine order. That much is solid ground. But once you begin to compare fragments, damaged passages, repeated motifs and later copies of older tales, the edges start to blur. One interpretation is that some of those blurred edges may preserve traces of more than one act of making, more than one conceptual beginning, or more than one divine attempt to solve the very old problem of noisy, needy, exhausting humanity. That's a possibility, not a certainty. So you picture the scene. A temple archive, shelves or baskets of tablets, scribes in training, a master correcting a line, a student muttering under his breath because he has pressed the same wedge sign wrong 3 times in a row, and now the tablet looks like it lost an argument. Somewhere in that quiet system, old stories travel forward. Most historians agree that Akkadian became one of the major written languages of Mesopotamia and the broader Near East, and that many Akkadian texts either borrowed from or stood beside older Sumerian traditions. In practical terms, this means that when you read an Akkadian myth, you're often listening to a conversation already centuries old. And conversations that old tend to keep secrets, or at least half-secrets. The Anunnaki, for their part, are real figures within Mesopotamian mythic tradition. not a modern invention. What's broadly accepted is that the term refers to a group of deities associated with divine authority, cosmic order, and in some contexts the underworld, or assemblies of gods. Scholars continue to debate exactly how their role shifts across periods and texts, because Mesopotamian religion is not a neat little filing cabinet where every god keeps the same job forever. Divine portfolios wander, titles overlap, family trees get messy. If your relatives have ever argued over who is technically in charge at a wedding, you already understand the basic mood. Still, when modern readers encounter creation stories involving gods, clay-blood labour, and divine frustration, the temptation is strong to imagine a hidden master narrative waiting to be unlocked, like a puzzle box. A fringe idea proposes that the text describe not merely the creation of humanity, but multiple human creations with one version hidden behind the official story. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does not come from nowhere. It grows from real features of the evidence, parallel myths, variant lines, damaged tablets, and the old scribal habit of preserving without fully explaining. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You walk farther into the dim archive of imagination and evidence. You smell dust, oil damp, reed matting, maybe a little bit of human effort, and not enough ventilation. Ancient cities were rich in incense and ceremony, yes, but also in sweat, a lot of sweat. Mesopotamian urban life was brilliant, organised, and deeply physical. The first listeners of these stories lived among canals, fields, workshops, and temples. They knew labour as a daily fact, not a motivational quote on a mug. So when a myth says humans were made to take on work once assigned to the gods, the idea lands in a world where labour structures everything. Most historians agree that myth and daily life were deeply entangled in Mesopotamia. Stories were not just entertainment. They helped explain order, suffering, duty, kingship, and why someone always seemed to be carrying bricks. And yet even in such a practical world, stories carry echoes. Sometimes the same story carries more than one echo. Historians still argue whether apparent contradictions between Mesopotamian creation accounts reflect different local traditions, different time periods, scribal creativity, or genuine attempts to preserve multiple theological ideas at once. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, some of it is thin. Some tablets are incomplete. Some lines are difficult. Some meanings depend on context that has not fully survived. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, an intriguing picture begins to form. Not a secret hidden like treasure in a locked box, but a puzzle hidden in plain sight, scattered across versions and fragments. What if the oldest story in the room is not the only one? What if the official creation story, the one copied more neatly and repeated more often, sits on top of older uncertainties like fresh plaster over reused brick? A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian myth does not always remember beginnings in a single straight line. It may remember them the way cities remember themselves, layer upon layer, foundation beneath foundation, old walls, beneath new walls, every level carrying a faint outline of what came before. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Tonight you are not here to prove anything. You are here to follow clues through clay dust, broken lines, and divine stories that may have changed even as scribes tried to preserve them. By the time this journey ends, you may decide the second creation is a metaphor, a scribal echo, a misunderstood overlap, or something stranger and softer than a conspiracy. But for now, all you need is the image of a tablet in lamplight, a stylus resting beside it, and the quiet suspicion that the first beginning may not have been the last one imagined. You stay in that dim archive a little longer, with the smell of clay and lamp oil settling around you, and the question shifts from who wrote the stories to why the stories begin at all. Not in the grand philosophical sense, though. Mesopotamia certainly had room for that, but in the practical sense that makes ancient religion feel oddly modern. Who is doing the work? Who is carrying the grain? Who is digging the canals? Who is feeding the gods, the kings, the households, and the entire nervous system of a city that would very much like another shipment of barley before sunset? Most historians agree that the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia depended on intense organised labour. Canals had to be dug and repaired, fields had to be irrigated, temples had to be supplied, mud brick had to be made in such insulting quantities that you begin to suspect civilization is in part a very elaborate excuse to move wet dirt from one place to another. Archaeology suggests that these early urban societies were sustained by systems of work so constant and structured that they shaped not only economics, but imagination itself. When people told stories about the gods, they did not leave labour at the door. Labour walked right in, sat down and demanded an explanation. That is one reason Mesopotamian creation stories feel so different from later traditions that emphasise beauty, moral perfection, or cosmic poetry. What's broadly accepted is that in key Mesopotamian myths, humans are created to serve a function. They are not always presented as the crown jewel of existence. Sometimes they feel more like the emergency staffing solution. Divine administration apparently had reached its limit. One interpretation is that this reflects the daily reality of the people who told these stories. If your world runs on relentless work, it makes sense that even the gods might complain about workload. A more cautious explanation could be that myth simply mirrors social logic. Power sits above, labour sits below. The universe in this model behaves suspiciously like a palace economy with better costumes. But what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the frustration of the gods preserves not just a social metaphor, but the memory of multiple attempts to solve the same divine problem? We are not there yet, but you can feel the floorboards creak in that direction. In the better-known Mesopotamian traditions, especially those reflected in Akkadian texts like Atrahasis, the gods themselves begin in a state of imbalance. There are higher gods and lower gods, decision-makers and labourers, managers, and to put it bluntly, celestial ditch diggers. Most historians agree that one major mythic pattern involves lesser gods becoming exhausted with toil and rebelling against their condition. The evidence we do have points to a story world where divine order is not serene at first. It is negotiated. It strains. It complains. Honestly, it sounds like the world's oldest staff meeting, except everyone is immortal and one bad agenda item can produce a flood. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but here the basic structure is well known. The gods need relief. A solution must be found. Humanity emerges within that crisis. What's broadly accepted is that human beings are fashioned so the gods no longer have to perform certain burdensome tasks. That mainstream anchor matters because it grounds the later mystery. Before anyone imagines hidden races, secret second species, or cosmic cover-ups in deluxe dramatic lettering, the first thing to understand is that human creation in Mesopotamian myth is functional. It begins as a labour answer, and that answer is already oddly revealing. A careful reading might suggest that when a culture imagines humans as a response to divine exhaustion, it is also revealing something about how fragile order feels. Cities do not maintain themselves. Fields do not water themselves. Temples do not feed themselves. Someone must always get up before dawn. Someone must carry, count, shape, sweep, repair, recite and obey. The myth does not hide this. It puts it right at the centre. You are made because work exists, which is not the most flattering origin story, but it is beautifully honest in a grim ancient way. Congratulations, you are a divine outsourcing project. Still, historians still argue whether these myths should be read mainly as reflections of social hierarchy, as theological speculation, or as layered literary traditions, combining different older ideas. That debate matters because if the stories are layered, then the creation of humanity may also be layered in the telling. Not necessarily repeated as a simple first batch failed, second batch succeeded sequence, but possibly preserved across overlapping versions that do not fully agree. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Imagine a scribe copying such a tale centuries after its earliest form. He inherits not one perfect original, but traditions already worn smooth by retelling. Some lines may have been familiar, others may already have puzzled him. A phrase about making humans from clay and divine substance survives here. A hint about previous disorder survives there. A note of divine dissatisfaction lingers somewhere else. One interpretation is that later texts preserve the final arrangement of several earlier ideas, much the way a rebuilt city preserves older walls beneath its courtyards. You do not always see the previous foundation, but it is still holding up the room. And then there is the emotional tone of these myths, which deserves attention. The gods are not distant abstractions floating above history in perfect peace. They are vivid, reactive, irritable, strategic. They hold counsels, make decisions, regret decisions, and sometimes seem to create beings, mainly because everyone is tired and somebody has to do the chores. That alone tells you something important. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion imagined the divine realm in ways that echoed political and social life on Earth. One interpretation is that humanity's creation was imagined not as a singular burst of wonder, but as a negotiated solution within an already stressed cosmos. What if that solution did not come all at once? What if the famous creation story we know best is the most stable, surviving version of a longer process, one in which divine planners considered attempted, revised, and concealed earlier possibilities? This theory isn't widely accepted, but it hangs around because Mesopotamian texts are full of repetitions with differences. Stories change shape, gods switch emphasis, details drift. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. When you read ancient myth through damaged tablets and later copies, you are not listening to a studio recording. You are listening to an old song heard through walls. And the old song in this section is about labour. Not abstract labour, not inspirational labour, not the kind of productivity that comes with a colour-coded notebook and a beverage that costs more than a Bronze Age goat. Real labour. Backbending, hand-cracking, canal scraping, grain hauling labour. Archaeology suggests that the people who told and copied these myths lived in societies where work shaped every hour and every hierarchy. So when the gods themselves complain about work, the story is not random. It is intimate. It is local. It feels true to the world that produced it. That is why this opening phase matters so much. Before you can ask whether there was a second creation of humanity, you must understand the first creation as Mesopotamian thought. Most often frames it not as a decorative miracle, but as an answer to divine burden. The evidence we do have points to this motive with unusual consistency. Humans are made because the system needs them. Yet even within that accepted frame, a careful reading might suggest unfinished edges, little hints that the system was not solved as cleanly as the official version implies. What if the first answer was not the final answer? The clay waits. The lamp flickers. Somewhere in the divine imagination, workers are about to be made. And if later traditions preserve even the faintest trace of revision, then humanity may enter the story not as one sudden beginning, but as the result of a problem the gods had more than one way of trying to solve. The problem of labour is now sitting in the middle of the room like an honoured guest. Nobody actually invited, and the story begins to gather itself around a solution. You can almost hear the soft scratch of the stylus as the familiar version of humanity's beginning takes shape, the one most readers encounter first, the one that feels official enough to wear a ceremonial beard and speak in a calm voice, while pretending the universe has always been neatly organised. But ancient Mesopotamia rarely stays neat for long. What's broadly accepted is that in the better-known Akkadian tradition, especially in the Atrahasis story, human beings are created after the lesser gods revolt against their labour. Most historians agree that this is one of the central Mesopotamian explanations for why humans exist at all. The gods need relief. A divine council forms. A decision is made. A being must be fashioned that can take up agricultural and ritual work, maintain the world below, and spare the divine realm from endless toil. It is on paper a very efficient plan. In practice, as you may already suspect, ancient plans made by stressed immortals do not always remain simple. The evidence we do have points to a creation process involving clay and divine substance, often described in terms that merge craftsmanship, sacrifice, and sacred animation. A god is killed in some versions, and from that mingling of material and essence, humanity is shaped. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian people understood clay intimately, so it is hardly surprising that they imagined life itself as something moulded from earth. Clay was everywhere. Houses were clay, tablets were clay, seals impressed clay. The city itself rose from mud as if civilization had simply decided to stand up and start billing people. So when myth says humans came from clay, the image would not have felt poetic and distant. It would have felt immediate. You could quite literally look at the wall beside you and think, yes, that seems about right. And yet even in this familiar version, there is something a little provisional about the whole arrangement. A careful reading might suggest that the official creation story is already a compromise. It solves a labour problem, yes, but it does so through a layered recipe and a tense divine procedure. This is not a smooth moment of pure inspiration. It feels engineered, debated, managed. One interpretation is that the myth reflects social realities about hierarchy and service. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply dramatises how ancient people thought order had to be built through effort and authority. But what if the polished story also covers earlier rough drafts? That is where the question of a second creation begins to stir more clearly. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There is no mainstream scholarly consensus that Akkadian texts plainly describe a secret, hidden second creation of humanity in the dramatic modern sense. That would be too strong. That would turn a puzzle into a headline wearing too much cologne. But historians still argue whether the differences between Mesopotamian creation traditions reflect separate local myths evolving theology, editorial reshaping, or traces of multiple conceptions of how humanity came to be. That is solidly a debate, and once you notice it, the official version stops feeling as singular as it first appeared. Imagine hearing a story told in several households across several centuries. In one version, the emphasis falls on rebellion among the gods. In another, on clay and divine blood. In another, on the mother goddess or birth imagery. In still another, on the consequences of human existence once the plan is underway. The broad outline holds, but the details do not stand still. Scholars continue to debate how much these changes matter. Are they simply decorative variations? The ancient equivalent of one grandmother adding extra cinnamon and another insisting that is absolutely not how the recipe works? Or do they preserve different stages of thought, different theological priorities, even different memories of what creation meant? One interpretation is that the standard creation of humanity may itself be the result of smoothing. Scribes copied old myths because they were valuable, but copying is not the same as freezing. Akkadian literature often preserves older ideas while arranging them into new emphases. The evidence we do have points to a culture of transmission in which texts were taught, repeated, and sometimes adapted. If a story had contradictions, those contradictions might not be removed entirely. They might simply be made manageable. A polished myth can still contain the scratch marks of revision, the way a reused tablet sometimes carries ghost impressions beneath the fresh writing. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Still, the atmosphere changes when you read the creation account with that possibility in mind. Humanity is made because the gods need workers, yes. That part remains on solid ground. But the act of making is complex enough to invite questions. Why this exact combination of ingredients? Why this exact divine procedure? Why do some traditions place stress on certain gods, while others nudge attention elsewhere? Why do some lines feel so compressed, as if they are summarizing a longer argument the audience no longer needs spelled out? The mystery is not that we suddenly have hidden proof of another human origin story. The mystery is that the surviving version feels like a final form that may have arrived after prior shaping. You can picture the Divine Council like a very old committee trying desperately to sound confident. Everybody wants the final decision recorded. Nobody wants the minutes from the embarrassing early brainstorming session. Option 1 was a disaster, please strike that, from the tablet. It is not impossible that ancient storytelling worked with something like that emotional logic, even if in a sacred and poetic register. A fringe idea proposes that the standard creation narrative hides an earlier attempt at making humanity remembered only in scattered inconsistencies and echoes. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the official story already behaves a little like a cleaned up settlement after a mess. And Mesopotamian myths do love a mess beneath the order. Most historians agree that these myths are not abstract metaphysics detached from life. They are about order under pressure. The gods are burdened. Humans are created. The burden shifts. The system stabilizes, at least for a while. That for a while matters because later parts of the tradition will show that humans do not remain simple servants forever. They become noisy, numerous, problematic. You begin to sense that the very solution celebrated in the creation story carries the seeds of future crisis. A careful reading might suggest that this instability is built in from the start. Humanity is not fashioned as a perfect answer. Humanity is fashioned as the best available answer. What if there had been another one before it? What if the story we know best is not false, but selective? Not invented from nothing, but curated? The evidence we do have points to a mythic tradition comfortable with repetition and revision. Archaeology suggests that scribes inherited stories with long histories, and when long histories are copied into authoritative forms, earlier possibilities do not always vanish. Sometimes they remain as tension as odd wording, as overlapping motifs, as the faint sensation that the official version arrived after the dust of older attempts had barely settled. So you sit with the famous creation we know best, and instead of asking whether it is true or false, you ask a gentler question. What kind of story is this trying to become? The answer may be that it is becoming stable, teachable, ceremonial, useful. But beneath that stability, the clay still seems warm, as if the shaping is not entirely finished, as if one beginning has been written clearly because another beginning was left in softer focus nearby. Now that the familiar version of creation is resting in your hands, neat enough to be taught and repeated, you begin to notice the places where the clay cracks. Not dramatically at first. No thunder, no convenient spotlight, no ancient priest gasping. At last, the hidden truth. Ancient evidence is usually less theatrical and much more annoying. It arrives chipped, broken, copied, late, missing context, and generally behaving like an object that has spent 3,000 years refusing to make your job easier. Most historians agree that our knowledge of Mesopotamian myth depends heavily on fragmentary tablets. Archaeology suggests that many texts survive only in pieces, often from libraries and archives that preserved copies rather than pristine originals. Corners are gone, lines are broken. Sometimes a word can be restored with confidence, and sometimes it sits there like a stubborn goat in the middle of the road, refusing to move, while scholars politely argue around it for a century. The evidence we do have points to a textual world where absence matters nearly as much as presence. That is especially important when people start building large conclusions from small gaps. A missing line is not automatically a secret. A damaged corner is not a divine wink. A more cautious explanation could be that the gaps in Mesopotamian creation stories come from ordinary loss, ordinary scribal variation, and the ordinary tragedy of clay being less immortal than the people who wrote about immortality. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, some of it is very thin indeed. And yet broken lines still matter. One interpretation is that fragments preserve traces of older narrative possibilities that later copies smooth over. That does not mean every damaged tablet once contained a shocking revelation about a hidden first humanity quietly swept under the divine rug. It means something gentler. It means that when stories survive in multiple copies across centuries, languages, and local traditions, their differences may hint at development. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. A line that sounds slightly off in one version may not prove anything, but it may raise the possibility that the story once had more room, more ambiguity, more roughness than the stable version suggests. You can picture the problem in a temple school. A student copies a text that has itself been copied from an older exemplar, which may already differ from another lineage of the same story in another city. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scribes were remarkably conservative in preserving literary and religious texts, but preservation does not always equal sameness. Even careful copying across long stretches of time can allow for omissions, substitutions, glosses, and rearrangements. Historians still argue whether these differences are mostly accidental, mostly local, or sometimes meaningful signs of competing traditions. That debate is where the broken lines begin to feel alive. Take the simple fact that creation myths in Mesopotamia are not confined to one single text with one single wording. What's broadly accepted is that Akkadian literature sits beside older Sumerian traditions and later Babylonian recensions, all participating in a much larger storytelling ecosystem. Some versions emphasize divine rebellion, others place more emotional weight on the act of shaping humans. Others lean into flood and overpopulation. The evidence we do have points to overlap, not uniformity. A careful reading might suggest that these stories behave less like a single polished doctrine and more like a cluster of remembered answers to the same cosmic problem. What if those answers did not all imagine humanity beginning in quite the same way? That possibility does not require conspiracy. It only requires history. Texts develop because cultures develop. Ritual needs shift. Political theology changes. Scribes inherit material with reverence, but also with purpose. A more cautious explanation could be that odd phrases in creation passages simply reflect regional style or poetic compression. That is often true, but sometimes a strange phrase stays strange. A repeated motif appears in one place and not another. A damaged line seems to imply something already known to the original audience, but no longer obvious to us. And once enough of those moments gather, you begin to understand why some readers have suspected that official creation traditions may stand on top of less tidy earlier ideas. This raises the possibility that what later generations regarded as the origin of humanity may have been, in textual terms, the surviving winner among several related formulations. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not the winner of a neat competition, and not necessarily the deliberate suppression of a fully alternate species narrative. That would be too dramatic and too clean. Ancient myth rarely hands you such convenient packaging, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the broken and variant evidence may suggest that multiple ways of imagining human beginnings circulated before one pattern became more authoritative. What if the second creation is not a secret event hidden by villainous gods in a cosmic filing cabinet, but a later dominant version that quietly replaced or absorbed an earlier one. That is less flashy, but honestly much more ancient. The appeal of a hidden second humanity comes partly from modern taste. We enjoy the idea that the real story was concealed, that the official version is only a mask, that somewhere in the damaged clay there is one decisive line waiting to blow the whole thing open. A fringe idea proposes exactly that. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because broken evidence invites imaginative repair. Humans are excellent at filling silence with drama. Give us half a tablet and we will promptly build a documentary trailer. But ancient texts ask for patience. They ask you to sit with uncertainty, which is harder and less glamorous, a bit like being told the mystery may remain mysterious and the snacks are symbolic. Still, uncertainty is not emptiness. Archaeology suggests that damaged texts can reveal real historical processes precisely because they are incomplete. You see layers, you see correction marks, you see duplicate copies with differences, you see places where a later tradition has become more regular than an earlier one. The evidence we do have points to a scribal culture deeply concerned with continuity, yet unable to erase all traces of variation. That is where tonight's idea gets its foothold, not in certainty, not in proof, but in the simple fact that the surviving lines sometimes feel like they were selected from a wider field of mythic memory. What if those missing corners once held language about another, making another attempt, another formulation of what humans were supposed to be? We cannot say they did. To be clear, this is debated, but neither can we say that the standard creation account floated down from heaven as one untouched and universal story. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature is layered, historical and messy in the best possible way, and messy traditions often preserve more than they intend. The official line may be clear, but the margins whisper. The copied text may be stable, but the fragments around it hint at roads not fully paved over. So you lean closer to the broken lines, not because they guarantee a hidden answer, but because they remind you that ancient memory survives in pieces. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Yet right here, in the chipped edges and missing phrases, you begin to feel the first real shape of the puzzle. If there was ever another conception of humanity's beginning in these traditions, this is where it would survive, not boldly announced, but half buried in damaged clay, like an old foundation beneath a newer floor. From those broken lines and chipped corners, your attention drifts toward one of the most interesting figures in the whole Mesopotamian cast, the god who so often appears where problems are complicated, rules are inconvenient, and humanity is in desperate need of someone clever rather than someone merely impressive. This is Ea in Akkadian, Enki in Sumerian tradition. The divine mind with damp hands and quick thoughts, the one associated with wisdom, fresh watercraft, and the sort of strategic calm that makes every divine council just a little more nervous. Most historians agree that Ea or Enki is one of the major deities of Mesopotamian religion and myth, and that he often functions as a helper, planner, mediator, or trickster-like problem solver. What's broadly accepted is that he plays important roles in creation, traditions, flood traditions, and stories where divine authority becomes a little too rigid for comfort. Archaeology suggests that his worship and symbolic associations were deeply rooted in southern Mesopotamian thought, especially around waters of life, subterranean freshness, and creative intelligence. If the pantheon were an office, he would be the colleague who quietly fixes the catastrophe, while everyone else is still debating whose fault it is. And once you notice that the puzzle sharpens, because if there were ever a god through whom an alternate creation memory might survive even faintly, Ea is a compelling candidate. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not because the texts plainly say Ea already made humans once before surprise, because they do not say that in any mainstream uncontested way, but one interpretation is that his recurring role as divine strategist may hint at layered traditions beneath the surviving surface. A careful reading might suggest that where Ea appears, especially in moments of crisis, compromise, or quiet resistance, the myth is preserving not just a character type, but a deeper theological tension about who really guides human fate. That is a possibility, not a certainty. You can feel that tension most clearly in the contrast between order and compassion. Mesopotamian myths often imagine the divine world as hierarchical, formal and decision-driven. Councils meet. Decrees are made. Senior gods expect obedience. Yet Ea repeatedly complicates that pattern. Most historians agree that in the flood tradition, for example, he is the god who warns Atrahasis or Utnapishtim in later tradition, thereby allowing humanity, or at least part of it, to survive. Historians still argue whether this should be understood mainly as a literary motif of clever mercy, as theological competition between divine personalities, or as the preservation of multiple regional emphases in storytelling. But whatever the explanation, Ea often stands close to humans when other gods step back. That matters a great deal tonight, because when modern readers wonder whether the Mesopotamian tradition hides some second act of creation, some earlier attempt, some alternate shaping of humanity that never became the official version, they usually search the fragments for clues in the wrong mood. They look for loud revelation. Ancient myth is often quieter than that. It works through role pattern and repeated positioning. The evidence we do have points to Ea being consistently aligned with ingenuity, secret wisdom, and carefully managed exceptions. One interpretation is that he represents the theological possibility that the cosmos is not run by brute decree alone, but by cunning revision. And what if the making of humanity belonged to that same pattern? What if the helper of mankind had already been involved in an earlier solution? This theory isn't widely accepted, but it grows naturally from Ea's mythic behaviour. He is not just a bystander in the grand story of humanity's existence. He is one of the divine intelligences closest to the process of making, preserving and adjusting life. In some traditions he advises, in others he intervenes indirectly. In flood narratives he finds a loophole. He may not openly defy the High Council in a theatrical rebel speech, but he has the unmistakable energy of someone who has read the policy manual and is now using the footnotes creatively. You smile a little at that because ancient religion can be grand and eerie. Yes, but it can also be deeply familiar. There is always one figure in the room who says, technically we are complying while absolutely changing the outcome. A more cautious explanation could be that Ea's role reflects the broader Mesopotamian admiration for wisdomcraft and practical intelligence. That alone would explain much. Cultures that depend on water management engineering, writing, and administration tend to respect cleverness. The evidence we do have points to wisdom being a sacred quality, not merely a convenient one. So Ea's recurring importance may simply express that value. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another reading begins to shimmer around the edges. Ea may preserve the memory of divine adaptation, not one fixed plan, but a willingness to revise the plan when order becomes too harsh, too unstable, or too self-defeating. And if humanity was itself a revised solution, then Ea belongs near that door. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths were not always concerned with consistency in the modern sense. They did not need every divine action to align perfectly across every text. Stories could overlap, contradict, and still remain meaningful. Scholars continue to debate how much those contradictions reflect living theology versus literary inheritance. Yet when one deity repeatedly appears at moments where human survival is preserved against stricter divine intentions, it becomes reasonable to ask whether that same deity may have stood behind older alternative visions of humanity's place. Not as proof, as pattern. The pattern is this: the gods face a problem. Humanity exists as a solution. Humanity later becomes another problem. Some gods lean toward removal or punishment. EA leans toward preservation. A careful reading might suggest that he is not just humanity's advocate after the fact, but part of the very logic by which humans remain possible. If so, then the idea of a hidden second creation becomes slightly less strange. What if the official creation account centers collective divine decision, while quieter currents in the tradition remember that one God again and again made continuation possible when the larger system faltered? A fringe idea proposes that EA may have sponsored, concealed, or protected an alternate human design, whether literally or symbolically. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is far too thin to state it boldly. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but it is intriguing that the god of a deep wisdom and hidden waters is so often associated with saving what others would discard. Water itself is a useful motif here. Fresh water in Mesopotamian thought is life-giving, subterranean, subtle moving beneath visible things. What if the memory of another humanity or another phase of humanity's making survives in the tradition the same way below the surface, feeding the visible story without openly announcing itself? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. So you imagine the temple school again. A student copies a creation story in its accepted form. Nearby, another text tells of divine warnings, clever evasions, merciful tricks, and a god who will not let destruction have the final word. The stories are not identical, but they speak to each other. EA stands between decree and survival, between structure and adjustment. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, by now, the mist has a shape. If there was more than one way Mesopotamian tradition imagined humanity becoming human, then EA, patient and strategic, feels like the divine figure most likely to have left fingerprints on the second draft. From EA's quiet intelligence, your thoughts move back to the actual act of making, because even the most mysterious theory has to pass through the workshop. However grand the story becomes, however many divine agendas you suspect are moving behind the curtain, humanity in Mesopotamian myth is not spoken into existence with effortless elegance. Humanity is mixed-shaped, prepared. The scene feels less like a fireworks display and more like a sacred craft room under pressure, which is somehow both profound and faintly exhausting. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation traditions often describe humans as formed from clay combined with some divine element. In the Akkadian Atrahasis tradition, the famous formula involves clay and the flesh or blood of a slain deity mixed so that humans carry both earthy substance and something of the divine realm. Most historians agree that this is one of the best-known ancient Near Eastern explanations for human nature, lowly and elevated at once, mud with memory, dust with a job description. Archaeology suggests that for people living among riverbanks, kilns, bricks and tablets, clay was not just symbolic, it was the material of daily existence. If you wanted to imagine life being shaped by hand, clay was the obvious choice. It was everywhere, rather like bureaucracy. Yet the recipe is not entirely uniform across traditions, and that is where things begin to stir again. A careful reading might suggest that different emphases in different texts are not random. Sometimes the stress falls on clay, sometimes on divine blood, sometimes on the birthing or shaping action itself, sometimes the maternal role of a goddess, often associated with birth or womb imagery, becomes central. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths preserve overlapping creation motifs rather than one perfectly fixed technical manual. Historians still argue whether these variations are mostly poetic, mostly regional, or signs of deeper differences in theological imagination. That debate matters because if the ingredients shift even slightly, the meaning may shift with them. One interpretation is that the varying recipe reflects competing ways of understanding what a human being is. Are humans mostly earth animated for labour? Are they partly divine, carrying sacred residue from a god's sacrificed life? Are they creatures of womb imagery and birth process, emphasising formation over assembly? A more cautious explanation could be that ancient poets simply liked multiple symbols and were not troubled by layering them together. That is very possible. Ancient myth is under no obligation to behave like a chemistry textbook. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the recipe variations may hint at more than decoration. What if each formula remembers a different stage in the conceptual making of humanity? That would not mean one tablet says version 1 had more clay, version 2 had better customer feedback. Ancient religion is rarely that tidy, but the symbolic ingredients matter. The evidence we do have points to a persistent tension between humanity as servant and humanity as carrier of something elevated. Clay explains mortality, labour, and weakness. Divine blood or flesh explains consciousness, duty, and perhaps the disturbing nearness between human and divine order. One interpretation is that the recipe is doing philosophical work. Another is that it is preserving multiple inherited strands that never fully merged. And what if each strand belonged to a different attempt to imagine people into being? This theory isn't widely accepted in any direct, literal sense, but it is one reason the second creation idea keeps attracting readers. If Mesopotamian tradition cannot quite decide whether humanity is principally moulded Earth's sacrificial remnant or sacred offspring of a birthing process, then the act of creation may have been remembered through more than one mythic lens. The official version can still be official while carrying earlier alternatives inside it, the way reused clay carries old impressions under a fresh surface. That image matters tonight. Tablets could be erased and rewritten. Bricks could be broken and reused. Cities could rise on older cities. Mesopotamian culture understood layering physically. Why would its myths be less layered than its streets? The presence of divine blood, in particular, gives the story a curious tension. Most historians agree that this motif helps explain why humans are not merely tools, but beings with some inner likeness to the divine sphere. At the same time, the myth does not flatter humanity too much. You are made to work. You are shaped for service. You are born into obligation. So the recipe creates a double nature, and the double nature creates questions. Why give workers such a potent ingredient? Why not make simpler servants? A careful reading might suggest that the answer lies in necessity. The gods need not just bodies, but minds capable of ritual memory speech and management. Civilization requires more than muscle. Even cosmic outsourcing needs paperwork. Still, the recipe feels expensive. A fringe idea proposes that the inclusion of divine essence reflects not a single act of creation, but an improvement over an earlier, less successful model of humanity. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the texts do not plainly spell that out. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. But the thought lingers because myths often explain present conditions by imagining prior insufficiency. If current humanity is both earthy and divine, perhaps that complex blend answers a problem simpler material could not solve. What if the first making remembered only dimly if it all lacked the right balance? What if the second making added memory, obedience, endurance, or something harder to name? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Then there is the role of the goddesses associated with shaping and birth. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation stories sometimes frame the making of humans through maternal and obstetric imagery, not merely artisan imagery. This matters because birth language implies process pain, repetition, and skill. Archaeology suggests that birth fertility and the management of life's continuity were sacred realities in the Mesopotamian world, not abstract symbols floating above experience. One interpretation is that humanity's creation was imagined less as a one-time manufacture and more as the establishment of a pattern that could continue. A more cautious explanation could be that divine midwifery imagery simply made cosmic creation feel familiar and embodied. But what if it also hints at stages? Birth is rarely imagined as instantaneous. It is prepared, laboured through, managed and repeated. If the creation of humanity sometimes borrows that symbolic register, then the idea of multiple phases becomes less alien, not proven, not announced, but imaginable within the texture of the myth itself. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, humans are made from clay and divine substance in Mesopotamian myth. In the mist, the changing recipe may preserve changing ideas of what humans were meant to be. So you return once more to the workshop in lamplight, bowls of clay, sacred words, divine substance, the careful hands of gods or goddesses shaping something that must live, work, speak, and endure. The recipe is not random. It carries theology in every ingredient. And because the recipe is layered, debated, and symbolically rich, it leaves open a quiet possibility. What if each version of the mixture remembers not merely one creation explained differently, but different attempts to explain why humanity needed to be made again in a more complete form? The workshop fades, but not completely. You still carry its smell with you, that mix of damp clay, lamp smoke, and the faint metallic seriousness of ritual. And now the story moves toward one of the darkest and most revealing pressures in Mesopotamian myth, the moment when the solution begins to sound like a problem again. Humanity has been made. The labour of the gods has been eased. Fields are worked. Offerings rise, cities pulse with movement. And for a little while the system appears to function. Then the old tension returns, because order in these stories is never a permanent achievement. It is a balancing act performed over water and mud, with very little room for error. What's broadly accepted is that in Akkadian literature, especially in atrahasis, humanity's growing numbers and noise become central to the plot. Most historians agree that this is one of the striking features of the tradition. Humans are not condemned because they are wicked in some later moralizing sense, but because they are loud, numerous, difficult, and disruptive to divine rest. There is something almost painfully human about that. Civilization solves one problem and immediately invents 3 others. You build cities, and now the cities are noisy. You create workers, and now the workers have children, demands rituals, complaints, and the audacity to keep existing after sunset. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian life was indeed crowded, labour-intensive and vulnerable to environmental stress. Flooding, drought, harvest failure, disease, and urban strain were not abstractions. They were woven into the fabric of existence. One interpretation is that the divine frustration in these myths reflects real anxieties about overpopulation disorder or the fragility of city life. A more cautious explanation could be that myth uses noise as a poetic shorthand for social pressure, the way a modern person says life is too loud, when what they really mean is that everything is falling apart and there are 12 tasks left before lunch. But what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the flood is not the first reset, only the first one remembered clearly? That possibility is where the second creation idea begins to tighten its grip. Most historians agree that the flood tradition in Mesopotamia is ancient and influential, and that the atrahasis story presents it as a response to humanity's troubling impact on divine order. The evidence we do have points to a sequence of escalating divine interventions before the flood itself. There are attempts to reduce human numbers through plague, drought, or famine, like pressures depending on the version and restoration. Humanity survives these measures often through the hidden assistance or warning of EA. Historians still argue whether these episodes should be read mainly as theological drama, reflections of real ancient disasters, or literary explanations for mortality and suffering. But however you read them, one thing becomes clear. The gods do not move straight from creation to stable peace. They move from creation to management, then from management to crisis. That is not a small detail. That is the atmosphere of the whole tradition. A careful reading might suggest that if humanity required repeated divine correction after being made, then the official creation story already contains the seeds of incompleteness. The first arrangement does not hold. The beings fashioned to relieve the gods become burdensome in their own right. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how myth dramatizes the cost of human life. Every blessing becomes a burden. Every solution breeds new problems. That alone makes sense. Yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the repeated crises may also hint that Mesopotamian tradition remembered humanity not as a finished product, but as something repeatedly adjusted. And that brings you very close to the notion of a reset. Now, a reset is not necessarily a second creation in the literal science fiction sense that modern imaginations love to dress up with hidden chambers and ominous music. Let me rephrase that more carefully. In mainstream historical reading, the flood is a destruction and survival narrative, not a clean statement that an entirely secret new humanity is then manufactured from scratch. That would go beyond the evidence. But the logic of reset is undeniably present. Creation happens. Humanity multiplies. Divine patience frays. Catastrophe follows. Survivors continue. New arrangements are imposed. Lifespans may be shortened in later reflections. Fertility and mortality become regulated. One interpretation is that this sequence behaves very much like a reconfiguration of humanity's terms of existence. What if that reconfiguration is the second creation not in body, but in condition? This theory is not widely accepted as a formal label, but it is a useful way of thinking. The flood may not erase every human and replace them with an obviously different model, yet it changes the nature of human life in mythic memory. After catastrophe, humanity continues under new limits. That matters. Most historians agree that ancient myths often encode cultural memory through transformations rather than neat philosophical statements. The evidence we do have points to a tradition interested in explaining why human life is now bounded by suffering, mortality and restraint. A careful reading might suggest that the second creation is hidden not in a separate workshop scene, but in the aftermath of divine disappointment. That is less flashy than a lost tablet screaming its secret from the desert, but frankly it is far more convincing. You can imagine the flood not simply as punishment, but as divine editing. Too many people, too much noise, too little rest for the gods. The solution is not to abandon humanity entirely, because humanity still serves a purpose. Instead, the system is revised through disaster and survival. A fringe idea proposes that this preserves a memory of an earlier human type, one too numerous or too unruly, replaced in effect by a later humanity living under stricter design. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it rests on a real feature of the story. The pre-flood and post-flood worlds are not identical. They feel related, yet altered, as if the old world has been reissued with stricter operating instructions and less optimism. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And once again, Ea stands nearby, refusing to let the reset become total erasure. What's broadly accepted is that he warns the flood hero through indirect speech, preserving life, while technically respecting divine decree in the most delightfully lawyerly way imaginable. Divine loopholes are apparently older than tax loopholes, which is honestly impressive. One interpretation is that EA's intervention preserves continuity between one humanity and the next. If there is a hidden second creation here, he becomes its midwife, not by making new people directly, but by ensuring that people remain at all. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, Mesopotamian flood traditions show divine frustration, attempted reductions of humanity, and a catastrophic reset followed by survival. In the mist, you begin to wonder whether the flood was remembered as more than destruction. What if it was the moment humanity was quietly remade, not in substance perhaps, but in scale, destiny, and design? The clay body may continue, but the human condition changes, and in ancient myth, that can be close enough to creation to leave a very long echo. By now, the story feels less like a straight road, and more like a city built in layers, each generation laying fresh brick over older foundations, while pretending the ground beneath is perfectly simple. You have creation, then burden, then adaptation, then flood, then survival, and each stage leaves behind not a clean conclusion, but a residue. That residue is where scholars spend a great deal of time peering into variant lines and parallel traditions, with the patience of people who know that one extra wedge mark can ruin a weekend. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature survives through copying across long periods of time, and archaeology suggests that this copying often preserved older material inside newer contexts. Akkadian texts can carry echoes of Sumerian antecedents. Later Babylonian recensions can reshape earlier ideas while still honouring them. The evidence we do have points to a scribal world that valued continuity deeply. But continuity did not always mean uniformity. A careful reading might suggest that contradictions between versions are not merely flaws in transmission. Sometimes they are fossils of earlier thought still visible in the rock. And that is why this section must linger on disagreement itself. Historians still argue whether apparent contradictions in Mesopotamian creation and flood traditions reflect local differences, chronological development, scribal error, theological layering, or intentional preservation of multiple truths at once. That debate is not a side note, it is the centre of the puzzle. If every version matched perfectly, there would be much less room for this idea of a hidden second creation. But because the traditions do not match perfectly, because they overlap and diverge, and sometimes seem to remember the same event through different symbolic lenses, the possibility remains open that something more complicated once stood behind the surviving surface. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You can feel this especially when similar themes appear in different combinations. In one place, the emphasis is on divine labour and rebellion. In another, on clay and sacred ingredient. In another, on excessive human noise and crisis. In another, still on survival through cunning and divine mercy. Most historians agree that these motifs belong to a broad, interconnected, Mesopotamian mythic world, rather than one single tidy composition from the start. Scholars continue to debate how these motifs came together, and whether their differences should be treated as small stylistic adjustments, or as clues to deeper conceptual shifts. One interpretation is that the contradictions matter, because they preserve stages of mythic development. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient audiences were less troubled by inconsistency than modern readers tend to be. That is probably true. Modern people hear two slightly different versions of the same story and immediately begin building colour-coded timelines, family trees, and mildly alarming internet threads. Ancient storytellers may have been more relaxed. A god could be emphasised differently in different texts without anyone fainting into their date syrup. Still, even if inconsistency was tolerated, it can still be meaningful. What if disagreement is the clue, not the obstacle? What if the very fact that the traditions resist perfect flattening suggests that older alternative ideas were never fully erased? This theory isn't widely accepted in any sensational sense, but it is compatible with how ancient literature often works. Texts accumulate. They do not simply replace one another like software updates. The old remains inside the new. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian scribes as preservers of tradition, not ruthless myth editors determined to achieve a single flawless canon. And because they preserved, they also transmitted tension. That tension matters for humanity's beginning. If one text emphasizes making workers, another emphasizes divine substance, and another frames post-flood existence as a kind of regulated continuation, then the human story is already more layered than a single moment of origin. A careful reading might suggest that creation in Mesopotamian thought is not always confined to a one-time event. It can include shaping, limiting, reordering, preserving, and redefining. One interpretation is that the so-called second creation may not be hidden as a separate scene at all. It may be distributed across the contradictions surviving as a pattern rather than a statement. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. This is where later readers often grow impatient. They want the one tablet, the one line, the one indisputable phrase that says, yes, there were two creations, one hidden and one official. Thank you for waiting, but ancient evidence almost never behaves that way. What's broadly accepted is that interpretation depends on assembling partial materials, comparing parallel versions, and resisting the urge to oversell what the evidence can bear. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In places here, it is thin, yet thin evidence can still point toward real structure, especially when the same pattern keeps returning from different directions. For example, there is a repeated rhythm in these traditions: problem solution, instability, revision, lesser gods, labour, humans are made, humans become, troublesome catastrophe. Loom's survivors continue under altered conditions. Most historians agree that this rhythm is present in broad outline. One interpretation is that the rhythm itself may preserve memory of more than one beginning. Not necessarily two fully distinct species of humans in the modern speculative sense, but two phases of what humanity is allowed to be. The first phase solves labour. The second phase solves excess. The first gives existence. The second gives limits. That reading is suggestive, not conclusive. A fringe idea proposes that scribes may have intentionally retained contradictory materials because they did not want to erase sacred traces of an earlier humanity tradition. This theory isn't widely accepted, and frankly, it assumes a level of deliberate secrecy that the evidence does not require. A more cautious explanation could be that contradictions survived because scribes were conservative, reverent, and practical. They copied what had authority even when full harmonization was impossible. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the result is still fascinating. The very conservatism of the scribes may have preserved the puzzle. They did not need to hide a second creation actively. They only needed to keep transmitting a tradition too layered to settle completely. So you picture the student again, pressing wedges into damp clay, copying a story older than his teacher, older than the room, older than the city walls outside. He may not know that certain lines come from different depths of memory. He may only know that this is what is to be copied. Yet through that act, contradictions live on. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, Mesopotamian myths survive through layered transmission and genuine variation. In the mist, you begin to suspect that the contradictions are not accidental clutter. They may be the surviving outline of another way ancient people once imagined humanity's beginning, a second form of the story, still breathing through a disagreement. The disagreement between texts leaves a strange aftertaste, and from that taste another possibility begins to rise, softer and more unsettling than a flood, because it suggests not merely revision after success, but the faint memory of failure before success. Not moral failure, at least not in the later, dramatic sense where everybody is wicked and thunder deserves a standing ovation. Something more practical than that. Something older. Something like a first design that did not hold. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths often explain the human condition through divine decisions, cosmic compromise, and the hard limits built into mortal life. People work, age, suffer, reproduce, pray and die within a structure set by powers above them. Most historians agree that this framework reflects ancient concerns about labour survival and order rather than modern ideas of individual self-fulfilment. Nobody in these texts is pausing to journal about work-life balance while sipping artisanal date tea. Humanity exists because the system requires it, and the system keeps requiring adjustments. That is where the thought of an earlier, less successful humanity starts to make emotional sense, even if the evidence remains incomplete. A careful reading might suggest that the standard creation of humanity in Mesopotamian tradition already sounds like a repair. The gods are overworked. A solution is needed. Humans are fashioned to take over burdens. But solutions generally appear after prior strain and sometimes after prior attempts. One interpretation is that the surviving myths may preserve only the successful or stabilised version of humanity's making, while earlier imagined forms, partial failures, or discarded concepts survive only as indirect echoes. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But the mood of the evidence allows the question. What if the lost creation was not glorious, but awkward? What if it was not a superior race hidden away in sparkling mystery, but an incomplete answer to the divine labour crisis? This theory isn't widely accepted, and to be clear, there is no mainstream tablet that simply says, "The first humans were a rough draft, please ignore." If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. Yet myth often works by presenting the final arrangement while leaving earlier instability visible around the edges. The evidence we do have points to repeated divine dissatisfaction in these traditions. Lesser gods are dissatisfied with labour, higher gods are dissatisfied with human noise. Humanity itself lives under conditions that feel managed rather than celebrated. Nothing in this cosmos arrives fully at peace. That restless atmosphere matters. A more cautious explanation could be that the idea of a failed first humanity is simply a modern way of reading ancient layers that were never meant to imply sequence. Variation might just be variation. Contradiction might just be contradiction. Most historians agree that we must be careful not to over-systematize ancient myths into neat evolutionary charts. Ancient stories can preserve multiple images at once without requiring a strict timeline between them. But historians still argue whether the tensions in creation and flood traditions reflect genuine stages of thought. And once that debate is admitted, the possibility of an earlier conceptual humanity becomes harder to dismiss entirely. You can feel that possibility in the way Mesopotamian stories describe human limitations. Humans are useful but noisy, necessary but troublesome, connected to divine substance yet still fragile and mortal. One interpretation is that this double quality might preserve the memory of compromise. A more cautious explanation could be that all myths of origin tend to give humans mixed status because that is exactly how human life feels. We are clever enough to build cities and foolish enough to flood our own fields through bad planning. We create literature and then lose half of it in storage. Frankly, a mixed review from the gods feels accurate. Still, compromise implies comparison. If humanity as we know it is the compromise model, then comparison with what came before becomes imaginable. Even if never fully narrated, archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian thought was intensely concerned with categories, functions, and order. People classified plants, signs, omens, professions, offerings, and ranks. The evidence we do have points to a culture comfortable with the idea that things could be arranged, revised, and named according to purpose. A careful reading might suggest that humanity too was understood functionally. If so, then a less effective earlier model of humanity is not a wildly foreign thought. It would fit the practical logic of the myths. If workers do not solve the labour problem, they are changed. If population becomes unmanageable, terms are altered. If order trembles, creation is adjusted. What if the first humans who failed were not erased from memory completely, but absorbed into the explanation of why later humans are the way they are. This raises the possibility that odd features of the tradition, especially the repeated need for divine correction, preserve a shadow of earlier insufficiency. Why must humanity be limited after the flood? Why do myths stress noise, fertility, mortality, and burdens so insistently? One interpretation is that these are not merely punishments, but design revisions. The first broad human condition proved unstable, so the later human condition became narrower, more controlled, more survivable for the divine order above it. That does not require a separate factory scene. It only requires a tradition that remembers human existence in phases. And phases are already everywhere in these stories. Creation solves labour, crisis solves excess, survival introduces limits. Most historians agree that this rhythm is present. The question is how to name it. Mainstream scholarship may call it mythic adaptation, literary, layering theological development, or changing anthropological imagination. A fringe idea proposes that it reflects two humanities, an initial form that failed and a later form that endured. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a strangely coherent way to read the tensions. The first humanity may have been too numerous, too loud, too unbounded, too poorly calibrated for the gods' own comfort. The later humanity survives because it is reduced, chastened, regulated. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. There is also something deeply human about imagining ourselves as the survivors of previous mistakes. Cultures often tell stories in which the present condition is explained by earlier excess, earlier disorder, earlier beings who did not quite fit the world. Mesopotamia is no exception. What's broadly accepted is that its myths frequently explain present order through prior chaos. One interpretation is that a first humans who failed idea fits that larger mythic habit, whether explicitly stated or only dimly implied. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how modern readers connect the dots. That may be partly true, but even that instinct is responding to real textual pressure. The surviving stories do not feel like the record of a single effortless, uninterrupted success. So you return once more to the image of clay under lamplight. Not the finished tablet this time, but the wet surface before the final signs are pressed in. A thumbprint, a smudge, a line wiped away and written again. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, Mesopotamian myths portray humanity as useful, yet problematic, repeatedly subject to divine adjustment. In the mist, a quieter possibility waits. What if the first humans who failed still survive in the tradition as a negative, shape the outline of what did not work, preserved only because the later humanity had to be made in answer to it? The idea of a failed first humanity lingers in the air like dust in lamplight, never quite settling, and from there your attention turns to the people who made sure any of these stories survived at all. Not the gods this time, but the scribes, the temple scholars, the careful hands and disciplined eyes that copied, organised and transmitted the memory of Mesopotamia across generations. If the myths feel layered, it is because real human beings preserve those layers, whether deliberately or simply because old traditions are stubborn and clay has a long memory. Most historians agree that scribes held an important place in Mesopotamian society. They were not merely copyists in the dull, modern sense of moving words from one page to another, while quietly losing the will to live. They were trained specialists, often attached to temples, palaces, or scholarly households, and they worked within a culture that treated writing as practical, sacred, and prestigious all at once. Archaeology suggests that scribal education involved copying sign lists, model texts, legal formulas, hymns and literary works until the hand obeyed almost automatically. The evidence we do have points to a system where knowledge was preserved through disciplined repetition and an enormous tolerance for clay dust. That matters because scribes do not preserve only words, they preserve order. What's broadly accepted is that temple and palace institutions helped shape cultural memory in Mesopotamia. Stories that were copied repeatedly became authoritative, teachable, and durable. One interpretation is that myths of creation and divine order would have been especially important in such settings because they underwrote the logic of hierarchy, duty, and ritual. A more cautious explanation could be that these were simply revered traditional texts transmitted because they mattered culturally, not because someone was actively curating ideology with a villain's grin and a dramatic soundtrack. That is probably closer to the truth. Ancient institutions rarely need cartoon secrecy. They shape memory simply by deciding what is worth preserving well. And that opens an interesting possibility. What if uncomfortable details in older humanity traditions were not erased outright, but softened as stories pass through scribal hands? This theory isn't widely accepted in a sensational way, and the evidence does not require us to imagine a grand suppression campaign carried out by stern priests in very serious hats. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin, but a careful reading might suggest that texts copied for instruction and authority could naturally drift towards smoother, more functional forms. If one version of a myth made better ritual or political sense, it would likely travel farther. The rougher alternatives might survive only in fragments, echoes, or side traditions. In other words, selective memory does not have to be malicious to be powerful. Historians still argue whether the differences between surviving Mesopotamian myths result mainly from chronology, geography, literary taste, or institutional preference. That debate matters here because if temple scholars favoured certain formulations, then the official creation story may owe some of its stability to usefulness as much as to antiquity. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was deeply intertwined with social order. Kingship temple service offerings, labour, and divine hierarchy formed a coherent world. A creation story in which humanity exists to work and maintain divine order fits that world very neatly. It flatters no one, but it explains everything. What if another version of humanity's beginning fit less neatly? What if there were earlier ways of imagining humans that were more ambiguous, more experimental, or simply less useful for the rituals and institutions that later shaped public memory? One interpretation is that older tensions survived beneath the official story because scribes preserved ancient materials conservatively even when those materials did not harmonize perfectly. A more cautious explanation could be that the surviving fragments just happened to preserve inconsistency by accident. That is always possible, but the evidence we do have points to scribes as both preservers and arrangers. They did not invent the myths from nothing, but they influenced which versions became central. You can imagine a school tablet copied by a student who does not fully understand why one line differs from another version he saw last year. He copies what is in front of him. His teacher corrects a sign. A corner chips off. Centuries later, scholars stare at the fragment and wonder whether that odd phrase reflects error-variant tradition or a glimpse of something older. It is almost comically humble as a mechanism for preserving mystery. No secret vault, no dramatic confession, just one sleepy apprentice, one damaged corner, and history patiently refusing to become simple. A fringe idea proposes that scribes intentionally concealed traces of a second creation of humanity because the official divine order required a cleaner story. This theory isn't widely accepted and frankly intentionally concealed is probably too strong for the evidence. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It may be enough to say that scribal culture could privilege stability. If older traditions implied multiple attempts at humanity or a more awkward divine process, those implications might not vanish, but they could become secondary. The polished version would rise to the top not because it was necessarily the oldest, but because it was the most useful. That is less exciting than a conspiracy, but much more plausible. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian scholarly culture prized inherited knowledge, commentary classification, and continuity. These were not chaotic storytellers making everything up anew every Tuesday. They were heirs to a long tradition, and that tradition rewarded preservation with structure. The evidence we do have points to the temple and scribal world as a place where memory was curated through repetition. A careful reading might suggest that the second creation, if it exists in any meaningful sense, would not be hidden by total silence. It would be hidden by emphasis. The official story gets copied whole. The alternate possibility survives only in contradictions, incomplete phrases, and the odd fact that humanity in these myths seems repeatedly revised. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. There is also a political edge here. Soft, but real. What's broadly accepted is that origin stories often support social order. If humans are made to serve divine needs, then labour has cosmic dignity, but also cosmic inevitability. Kingship and temple service begin to look less like historical arrangements and more like the architecture of reality itself. One interpretation is that a revised humanity narrative could help justify who rules who labours and why the system must continue. A more cautious explanation could be that myths do not create social hierarchy, so much as mirror and bless what already exists. Either way, an origin story that is orderly and singular serves institutions well. What if the second creation was too messy for ceremony? What if it suggested hesitation trial or adaptation in the gods themselves? Such a memory might remain, but only in softened form, because ritual prefers stable beginnings. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, scribes and temple institutions shape the survival of Mesopotamian myths through copying and educational transmission. In the mist, you can just make out another possibility that the second creation of humanity was not hidden behind locked doors, but beneath the polished surface of the story the scribes found most worth keeping whole. The polished surface of the story now gives way to another texture entirely. One softer and older than law, older than kingship, older even than the tidy confidence of scribal schools. You move from tablets and councils into the language of birth itself, into the part of Mesopotamian imagination, where humanity is not only moulded like a brick or assembled like a tool, but carried shaped and brought forth through imagery that feels intimate, bodily, and sacred. If the workshop gave you hands and materials, this part of the tradition gives you breath, womb, pain, and timing. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation traditions sometimes involve goddesses associated with birth shaping and maternal craft. Figures such as Nintumami or related maternal divinities appear in traditions where humanity's creation is described through the language of birth and midwifery as much as through the language of artisan work. Most historians agree that this is a significant feature of the tradition. Humanity is not simply manufactured like a divine storage jar. Humanity is also gestated in imagination, brought into the world through a sacred process that ancient listeners would have understood, not as abstract theology, but as one of the most powerful realities of daily life. Archaeology suggests that fertility, childbirth, and household continuity were central concerns in Mesopotamian society. People live close to birth and death in ways that make modern life, with its sealed walls and tidy schedules, feel almost padded. Midwifery, family lineage, and survival through reproduction were not sentimental themes. They were existential ones. So when creation myths borrow the language of womb labour and delivery, the image is doing serious work. One interpretation is that it grounds the cosmic in the familiar. A more cautious explanation could be that maternal symbolism simply made divine creation understandable in human terms. That alone would make sense, but what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the birth imagery hints that humanity's making was imagined as a repeated act rather than a single event? That possibility matters because birth is not usually the symbolic language of instant perfection. Birth suggests stages, preparation, waiting, danger, skill, and repetition. Most historians agree that when Mesopotamian myths use maternal or obstetric imagery, they are drawing on a model of formation that is embodied and procedural. Historians still argue whether these images should be treated mainly as poetic ornament or as a deeper theological statement about what creation means. But either way, the symbolism changes the atmosphere. You are no longer in a one-time factory of divine labour policy, you are in a sacred room of process. And process leaves room for phases. A careful reading might suggest that this maternal dimension of creation makes the idea of more than one human beginning easier to imagine within Mesopotamian thought. Not proven, not announced, but imaginable. If humanity can be spoken of as formed in a way that resembles birth, then humanity can also be imagined in terms of labour pains, multiple stages, or repeated acts of bringing forth. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient myth simply liked to layer metaphors without implying sequence. That is certainly possible. Mesopotamian storytellers were not submitting formal diagrams for peer review, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, birth symbolism may preserve the sense that human existence unfolded through sacred making more than once. This theory isn't widely accepted in explicit terms, yet it has a certain quiet strength, because the maternal figures in these myths are not usually casual participants. What's broadly accepted is that they stand close to the threshold between divine plan and human life. They shape, they pronounce, they oversee emergence. They are associated not merely with result, but with the act of becoming. The evidence we do have points to a worldview in which making life is not a purely administrative act, even when it serves administrative ends. Humanity may exist to bear burdens, yes, but humanity is also brought forth through ritualized embodied imagery. That tension is important. Workers are being made, but the language used for making them exceeds mere utility. Why give cosmic labourers the symbolism of birth? One interpretation is that Mesopotamian thought recognised something irreducible in human life, even when speaking about service and hierarchy. A more cautious explanation could be that birth language was simply too powerful and too familiar to ignore. Yet once the metaphor enters the room, it does not sit quietly in the corner. It changes the whole mood. Birth implies not only creation, but continuation. It implies that what begins can begin again. It implies that forms of life can be brought forth under different conditions, with different pain, with different outcomes. And that very gently edges you closer to the possibility that the so-called second creation of humanity may have been remembered less as a secret duplicate species and more as a renewed act of sacred bringing forth. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You might even say that the maternal imagery helps explain why Mesopotamian creation myths feel less tidy than later philosophical summaries would prefer. Birth is messy. Not graphically, not tonight, but existentially. It involves uncertainty, risk management, and a great deal of hope pinned to processes nobody fully controls. Ancient listeners would have known that perfectly well. So if the gods bring forth humanity through birth-like imagery, they are not merely making a thing. They are participating in a process whose outcome matters and may require revision. Most historians agree that creation myths often reveal what a culture fears as much as what it believes. One interpretation is that the presence of divine birth language reveals a deep awareness that life once produced is never fully predictable. That would fit these stories rather well. Humans are made to solve one problem, then they become another. Flood and scarcity follow. Limits are imposed. Survival continues. The broad arc already behaves as if humanity is being managed through stages. A fringe idea proposes that maternal creation imagery preserves memory of literal multiple creations, distinct waves of human making hidden inside the official tradition. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the surviving texts do not justify saying it boldly. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin. But even without going that far, the maternal dimension strongly supports a softer claim that Mesopotamian tradition may have understood human beginnings as more processual, layered and repeated than the single polished creation story alone suggests. And there is something almost tender in that possibility. Not tender in a sentimental way. Mesopotamian myths are too stern for that, but tender in the sense that humanity is not just thrown into existence like equipment unloaded from a cart. Humanity is shaped through care ritual and sacred strain, even when made for labour. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, maternal and birth imagery plays a real role in Mesopotamian creation traditions. In the mist, that imagery begins to sound like an echo of repetition. What if humanity came into being not once in a single divine decision, but in stages each one imagined as a new labour of sacred making, each one answering the instability of the one before? From the sacred room of birth and shaping the story, drifts outward again into the public world, into courtyards, temple steps, palace walls, and the larger architecture of power, because in Mesopotamia, the question of what a human being is never stays private for long. It becomes political almost immediately. If humans are made for labour, then labour belongs to the order of the cosmos. If humans are shaped under divine authority, then authority itself begins to look older than memory. And if the story of humanity changes even a little, then the meaning of rule may change with it. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kingship was deeply entangled with religion. Most historians agree that rulers did not present themselves merely as secular administrators in nice jewellery. They stood within a sacred order responsible for justice, ritual building, warfare, and the maintenance of the bond between city and gods. Archaeology suggests that inscriptions, temple foundations, royal hymns, and public monuments consistently frame kingship as something sanctioned by divine will. In other words, political order did not float separately from myth. It was nested inside it like a smaller clay tablet tucked within a larger envelope. That matters because creation stories are never just about the beginning. They are also about permission. What's broadly accepted is that origin myths often help explain why the world is arranged the way it is now. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian creation traditions support the logic of hierarchy by placing human labour within a cosmic framework. A more cautious explanation could be that myths mirror social order rather than inventing it. That is very likely true. Cities, institutions, and inequalities existed before any one surviving tablet was copied. Yet once a myth says humanity was fashioned to serve divine needs, the everyday demands of work, tribute, and obedience begin to feel less like temporary historical arrangements and more like the bones of reality itself. And that is where a revised humanity story becomes particularly interesting. What if the official version of human creation became important not only because it was old, but because it was politically useful? This theory isn't widely accepted in a crude, cynical sense, and the evidence does not require us to imagine priests and kings sitting together in a smoky room saying, "Let us finalise the labour-friendly origin story." Ancient societies were more sincere and more complicated than that. Still, a careful reading might suggest that stories which reinforce stable roles tend to travel well in stable institutions. If a version of humanity's origin emphasised divine service, human duty, and orderly hierarchy, it would fit beautifully within palace and temple life. What if another version fit less beautifully? Historians still argue whether the development of Mesopotamian myths should be read mainly as literary evolution, theological negotiation, or institutional adaptation. That debate matters here because if stories changed, as societies changed, then the surviving form of creation may partly reflect later needs. Kingship becomes more formalised. Temple economies become more complex. Bureaucracy expands. Labour becomes increasingly organised. Under those conditions, a creation story that presents humanity as designed for service is not merely believable. It is almost irresistible. The evidence we do have points to myths and institutions reinforcing each other. Kings build temples because the gods demand honour. Temples organise labour because ritual requires provision. Humans work because the world depends on maintenance. One interpretation is that the standard creation account became a powerful explanation for the social whole. A more cautious explanation could be that it simply endured because it made sense within the world that kept copying it. Either way, it begins to look official in more than one sense. It becomes not just a sacred memory, but a social grammar. And social grammars do not always love ambiguity. If there were older or parallel traditions suggesting that humanity emerged in more than one phase through more than one attempt, or under less settled divine consensus, those traditions might remain awkward for public order. Not dangerous exactly, but untidy. What if the gods hesitated? What if humanity was revised? What if the present form of human life is the result not of one stable decree, but of trial correction and partial redesign? That kind of story can still be sacred, but it is less ceremonially convenient. A king prefers foundations, not drafts. A temple prefers continuity, not theological shrugging. You can feel this in the way Mesopotamian kingship is often linked to the restoration of order after chaos. Most historians agree that royal ideology regularly presents the ruler as builder-organizer, protector, and servant of divine arrangement. Archaeology suggests that this was not empty propaganda in the modern sense, but a meaningful and lived political theology. The ruler restores canals, rebuilds walls, renews temples, and re-establishes proper boundaries. One interpretation is that this same cultural instinct would naturally favour a creation story that is singular and stable. A more cautious explanation could be that the preference for stability was so widespread that no deliberate suppression was needed. The smoother narrative simply felt more true. That is less sinister, but more powerful. A fringe idea proposes that the second creation of humanity was hidden because it threatened elite control, suggesting that human identity was more fluid or contested than official religion wished to admit. This theory isn't widely accepted, and on current evidence, it goes too far. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin, but even without that dramatic leap, something more modest still holds. The social usefulness of a myth can influence its survival. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian institutions favouring order, continuity, and repeated forms. A creation account that supports those values has every advantage. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And perhaps that is why the second creation, if there is one, feels so hard to grasp directly. It would not necessarily vanish because it was forbidden. It might fade because it was less useful for ceremony, less suitable for kingship, less aligned with the visible architecture of authority. It would survive only where official order could not completely smooth the clay in contradictions, in repeated resets, in odd phrases about making and remaking, in the sense that humanity's role is explained too often to be fully simple. So you stand in the public square at dusk, hearing distant footsteps, perhaps the murmur of a market closing, perhaps the low chant from a temple where offerings are being arranged once again. Somebody records grain, somebody seals a jar, somebody bows before a statue. The whole city is an argument for structure. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, Mesopotamian kingship and temple order were bound tightly to sacred ideas about human duty and divine hierarchy. In the mist, another thought persists. What if the second creation of humanity was never fully erased, only overshadowed by the version of the story that best explained why some command, some serve, and the world must keep moving in its carefully measured lines? From the measured lines of kingship and temple order, your mind naturally wanders toward the louder, stranger ideas that have gathered around the Anunnaki in modern times. Because no journey through Mesopotamian myth in the 21st century gets very far before somebody arrives insisting the gods were engineers. The tablets are secret manuals, and humanity was assembled in what sounds suspiciously like an ancient industrial park with terrible management. It is a very modern kind of excitement, and like all modern excitements, it benefits from a little decaf. What's broadly accepted is that in Mesopotamian religion, the Anunnaki were major deities within a mythic and cultic world, not extraterrestrial visitors in the modern science fiction sense. Most historians agree that the ancient texts place them inside a divine order shaped by ritual kingship, underworld themes in some contexts, and cosmic hierarchy, not by spaceships, laboratory, badges, or emergency meetings about DNA samples. Archaeology suggests that when Mesopotamian people invoked these gods, they were speaking about sacred powers within their own religious imagination. That is the solid ground. We begin there because once you step off it, the sand gets very soft very quickly. Still, the sand is interesting. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki engineered humanity more than once, creating early versions and then refining them, hiding one creation behind another. This theory isn't widely accepted, and in its louder modern forms, it often leans far beyond what Akkadian texts can reasonably support. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In many of these claims, it is not just thin, it has been stretched like old dough and asked to cover an entire banquet table. Yet one reason the rumour survives is that it attaches itself to real features of the ancient evidence creation from mixed substances, layered myths, repeated divine dissatisfaction, flood resets and variant traditions that do not fully agree. That is how fringe theories often survive. They do not grow from pure emptiness. They grow around unanswered questions. The evidence we do have points to a genuine puzzle in Mesopotamian creation literature. Humanity is made through a complex act involving clay and divine essence. Humanity exists to relieve divine labour. Humanity later becomes burdensome. Catastrophe follows. Limits are imposed. Stories differ in detail. Gods like Ea complicate the official line. Most historians agree that these features are real. One interpretation is that modern Anunnaki theories exaggerate them into literal hidden history. A more cautious explanation could be that the exaggerated theory persists because the ancient material already feels layered and unfinished enough to invite overreading. What if the wild version survives because it senses a real gap even while filling it badly? That is a useful question because it helps you separate mood from evidence. You do not need to accept the loudest modern claims to recognise why they appeal. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe gods making humans for labour, sometimes with divine blood involved. That alone is startling material. Add flood traditions, divine councils troubling resets, and fragmentary tablets, and you have exactly the sort of recipe that modern imagination loves to season beyond recognition. One day you're reading about Akkadian myth, and the next day someone online is confidently explaining that your ancestry was revised in a celestial genetics department. The internet, bless it, has never met a broken tablet. It did not want to turn into a trailer voiceover. But if we move more carefully, something subtler appears. A careful reading might suggest that the modern fringe obsession with multiple human creations is not wholly absurd in emotional shape, only in its certainty and literalism. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The mainstream evidence does not support bold claims that the Anunnaki literally ran repeated bioengineering programs in the way modern speculative narratives often describe. That would go too far. But the myths do preserve repeated divine human adjustments, and they do leave open the possibility that humanity's beginning was imagined in more than one phase or under more than one formulation. Historians still argue whether those phases belong to literary development, theological layering, or something closer to conceptual recreation. That is the real debate, and it is more interesting than the shouting. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian myth works symbolically, ritually, and socially. It is not a coded lab report, yet symbols can still carry structural memory. One interpretation is that later fringe readers are responding clumsily to the same tension scholars notice more carefully. The human story in these texts is not as singular and tidy as later summaries sometimes make it sound. A more cautious explanation could be that humans simply enjoy dramatic secret histories. That is undeniably true. Give us one damaged line and we will cheerfully construct a hidden civilization before lunch. Still, the attraction of the second creation idea does tell you something. It tells you that the official story leaves room around its edges. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. This is where the phrase Anunnaki can become misleading if used too loosely. Most historians agree that the various Mesopotamian creation traditions do not always place every divine group in the exact same function, and the role of the Anunnaki can shift by context and period. Scholars continue to debate how broad or specific the term is in different texts, so when modern retellings say the Anunnaki did this with perfect confidence, they often flatten a much more nuanced mythic landscape. Ancient divine worlds are not tidy casts where every god signs the same project brief. Titles move, roles overlap, traditions develop. The evidence we do have points to complexity, not a single monolithic team of cosmic engineers. And yet, the desire to simplify them into one dramatic group doing one dramatic thing may itself echo the old Scribal desire for stable narrative. Humans do like a clean plot. Gods make people. People fail. Gods revise. Done. But the ancient material resists that. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the Anunnaki are deities within Mesopotamian religious tradition, and mainstream scholarship does not read the texts as hidden alien engineering records. In the mist, however, the modern rumour of multiple creations may be clumsy evidence of a real intuition, that the surviving myths preserve humanity as a repeated problem answered more than once in more than one way. A fringe idea proposes that the exaggerations endure precisely because they amplify something already present in the text, the feeling that humans were revised. This theory isn't widely accepted in that form, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers a useful caution. Sometimes bad interpretations grow on top of good questions. The challenge is not to mock the question just because the answer has been overcooked. It is to return to the tablets, the broken lines, the layered myths, and ask again, more quietly, whether the idea of a hidden second creation is really about secret technology at all. What if it is about memory? What if the wild modern story survives because ancient Mesopotamian tradition truly does preserve a puzzle about human beginnings? A puzzle later readers sense but misunderstood. Not a secret laboratory, not a cosmic conspiracy in polished chrome, but a layered religious memory in which humanity is made, adjusted, limited, and perhaps in some mythic sense remade. The louder rumour may be wrong in almost every detail, yet still circling a genuine centre of gravity, and that centre is simple enough to fit in your palm like a clay tablet. The human story in Akkadian tradition may not begin only once. By this point the louder rumours have done their noisy little dance and shuffled politely off to the side, leaving you again with the quieter material that usually matters more, the actual shape of the surviving evidence, the parts we can stand on and the mist that gathers just beyond it. That is a gentler place to end up, because ancient Mesopotamia rarely rewards certainty for very long. The tablets survive, yes, but not as a neat confession. They survive as fragments, echoes, reworkings, and carefully copied stories that do not quite settle into one final answer, no matter how neatly you stack them. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation literature reflects real ancient concerns about labour, divine order, survival, and the difficult maintenance of civilization. Most historians agree that stories such as Atrahasis are not random fantasies detached from life. They are mythic explanations rooted in the realities of floodplains, temple economies, social hierarchy, population pressure, and the perpetual burden of keeping cities alive. Archaeology suggests that this world was fragile, organised, and deeply dependent on coordination. Canals had to function, fields had to yield, offerings had to be delivered. Somebody always had to wake up early and do something inconvenient with water. That mainstream ground matters because it keeps you from floating too quickly into the clouds. A careful reading might suggest that once humanity is created to manage those burdens, the myth is already making a large statement about what people are for. Yet the same body of the literature also shows that the answer does not remain stable. Humans become noisy, the gods react, resets appear, limits are imposed, variants of the story preserve different emphases, different ingredients, different divine roles. Historians still argue whether these shifts reflect separate local traditions, scribal development, theological layering, or simply the ordinary untidiness of ancient literature. That debate is not a problem to be solved before bedtime. It is the actual substance of the mystery, because the puzzle may not lie in one hidden line at all. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the second creation of humanity is less a secret event buried behind the official myth and more a pattern visible only when you stop demanding a single dramatic reveal? This theory isn't widely accepted as a formal conclusion, and it would be misleading to state it too strongly. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The surviving Akkadian material may not describe a second creation in one explicit, straightforward scene, but one interpretation is that it preserves the human story in multiple phases of divine making, managing, revising, and redefining. If so, the second creation would be spread across the tradition rather than locked inside one text. That is less glamorous, but much more compelling. The evidence we do have points to at least three strong layers in how humanity is imagined. First, there is the initial act of making workers to relieve the gods. That much is broadly accepted. Second, there is the repeated failure of that arrangement to remain calm and balanced, culminating in flood and regulation. Third, there is the post-crisis humanity that continues under different conditions, as if existence itself has been narrowed into a more manageable shape. A more cautious explanation could be that these are simply mythic episodes within one story arc. And yes, they are. But a careful reading might suggest that the arc functions almost like successive definitions of what a human being is allowed to be. In that sense, the human story becomes less like a single birth certificate and more like a long negotiation. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths are comfortable with layered meaning. Gods can represent natural forces, political realities, ritual roles, and theological principles all at once. So it would not be strange if creation itself also carried more than one meaning. Not merely the first moment of animation, but also the setting of limits, the revision of terms, the survival of a remnant, the reshaping of human destiny through catastrophe and law. One interpretation is that later readers searching for a hidden second humanity may be sensing this layered structure even when they name it too literally. A more cautious explanation could be that modern minds simply prefer puzzles with hidden compartments. That is also true, but the attraction of the idea still points back to something real. The tradition does not remember humanity as static. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can feel that most strongly in the overlap between solid fact and soft possibility. On solid ground, Mesopotamian texts do not offer a clean, uncontested statement that the Anunnaki secretly made humanity twice and hid the first attempt behind the second. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is too thin for that claim. On softer ground, however, the same texts do preserve enough variation, enough repeated adjustment, and enough theological tension to support a more modest but still fascinating thought. Humanity may have been imagined as a project revised more than once, not necessarily in body alone, but in purpose, scale, and condition. And perhaps that is the more interesting version anyway, because a literal hidden first humanity would be dramatic, yes, but also strangely simple. Ancient religion is usually richer than that. It speaks in layers. It uses the same story to explain work, kingship, suffering, mortality, fertility, and flood memory all at once. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, Mesopotamian creation literature gives you a world where humans are made for labour, they're managed, reduced, and bounded. In the mist, you begin to see how that sequence can resemble a second creation without ever calling itself one. A fringe idea proposes that scribes preserve this ambiguity, intentionally leaving later generations with clues instead of conclusions. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence does not require such deliberate design. A more cautious explanation could be that ambiguity simply survived because tradition is conservative and memory is layered. Scribes copied what they inherited. Gods retained older features. Stories developed new uses. The result is not a secret message so much as an ancient sediment, each layer pressed atop another, until the older shapes remain visible only in profile. What if that is why the story still feels alive? Not because it has been solved, but because it resists being solved completely. What's broadly accepted is enough to ground you. The rest stays open, not empty, but open. And openness has its own power. The second creation, if we can use that phrase gently, may be less a lost event than a lost way of reading the human condition preserved in myths that understand people as made, remade, corrected, and continued under pressure. So you find yourself back where the best old stories often leave you standing between brick and mist. The tablet is real. The break in the tablet is real. The version copied by the scribe is real. The older possibilities hovering behind it are harder to hold, but not meaningless. What's broadly accepted is clear enough to teach. What remains debated is rich enough to keep whispering. And in that whisper, faint but persistent, you can hear the possibility that humanity in Akkadian tradition was never only created once, but continuously reimagined, until the surviving story became the one most people learned to call the beginning. And so you arrive at the last quiet chamber of the night, carrying with you everything the clay has allowed, and everything the clay has refused to say plainly. The lamps are lower now. The archive feels deeper. The dust on the shelves seems almost soft. You have walked through labour and flood, through divine counsels and maternal shaping, through scribal memory and political usefulness, through the louder modern rumours, and back again into the patient dimness of Akkadian tradition. And after all that, the question remains not simple, but gentler. Did the Anunnaki, or the broader divine world of Mesopotamian myth, hide a second creation of humanity? What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature does preserve a real and complex story of human origins. Most historians agree that humanity is created in these traditions to relieve divine labour, using imagery of clay, divine substance, and sacred shaping. Archaeology suggests that these myths grew out of a real world of irrigation, hierarchy, ritual, and urban strain. That is the solid ground, and it is enough to stand on without embarrassment. Humans are made because the cosmos, as Mesopotamians, imagined it needs workers, maintainers, speakers of prayers, bearers of burden, and dwellers within a carefully strained order. But the story does not stay there. A careful reading might suggest that the human condition in Akkadian tradition is revised more than once. The beings, made to solve divine exhaustion, become noisy, numerous, and difficult. The gods intervene. Flood and reduction enter the story. Survivors continue under altered terms. Birth imagery suggests process. Variant traditions preserve different emphases. EA stands repeatedly near adaptation and survival. Historians still argue whether these features amount to literary layering, theological development, social reflection, or something closer to multiple remembered conceptions of humanity. That debate is real, and it is where the deeper version of tonight's title begins to breathe. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not plainly hand you a secret doctrine saying there were two fully separate creations of humanity, one hidden neatly behind the other. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is too thin for that stronger claim. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki deliberately concealed an earlier human experiment, and this theory isn't widely accepted. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the surviving myths do support a softer and in many ways more interesting thought. Humanity in these traditions may have been imagined in phases first made, then judged, then limited, then continued under new conditions, as if creation itself was not a single moment, but a sequence of divine adjustments. That possibility, not certainty, is the real treasure in the dust. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm a hidden lost race of earlier people in the dramatic modern sense. We cannot confirm that every contradiction in the tablets points back to one suppressed origin story. We cannot confirm that later scribes consciously buried a dangerous truth. But one interpretation is that Mesopotamian myth remembers humanity as a repeated answer to repeated problems. Labour requires a solution, excess requires restraint, survival requires mercy, order requires revision. What if the second creation of humanity is hidden not as a missing chapter, but as the overall pattern of the story itself? What if the beginning keeps happening? That perhaps is why the idea refuses to disappear. Not because the evidence shouts, but because the structure hums. The first humanity is the labour answer. The later humanity is the regulated remnant. The first act gives purpose. The later act gives limits. Most historians agree that myths often explain the present by narrating a transition from instability to a more durable order. One interpretation is that Akkadian tradition does exactly this with human life. A more cautious explanation could be that we are simply naming the arc too boldly. That is fair. Still, the arc remains. Humans in these stories are not just made, they are managed into becoming the kind of humans the cosmos can tolerate. And that is an ancient, almost hauntingly practical idea. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On solid ground, the official Mesopotamian creation story tells of humanity fashioned to bear divine burdens. In the mist, you can just make out another outline beside it, the possibility that the later bounded human condition is itself a second making hidden in plain sight within flood, survival and revision. Not a separate species marching dramatically from the reeds, but a quieter remaking of what human life is allowed to be. Now the pace softens. The tablets rest where they have rested for centuries, cool and patient in the dark. The gods become quieter too, less like figures in argument, and more like distant presences fading into the grain of old clay. You no longer need them to confess. You no longer need the missing corner to return. The archive has already given what it can. A few solid shapes, a few open doors, a few echoes that linger longer than they should. You let the question settle. The canals outside are still. The city is far away now, blurred into moonlight and dust. Somewhere a reed stirs in the water. Somewhere a lamp gutters low. Somewhere a scribe long vanished has left a wedge-shaped mark that outlived his voice by thousands of years. And that is enough. More than enough, really. Enough for one night. Enough to remind you that the oldest stories rarely end by closing. They end by dimming. So you breathe a little slower. You let the clay become only clay again, and the gods become only names. And the names become sound, and the sound becomes hush. If humanity was made once or twice or many times in the imagination of ancient Mesopotamia, you do not need to solve it now. You only need to feel how gently the mystery remains. Warm mud in careful hands, a tablet drying by lamplight, water moving under the foundations, a story copied, revised, broken, remembered. And with that last image, the night can hold you softly.